In their classic book called Boundaries, When to Say Yes, How to Say No, to Take Control of Your Life, Henry Cloud and John Townsend give us a glimpse into a life without healthy boundaries through the fictional life of a woman named Sherry. And I'm going to share with you Sherry's life. Try as she might, Sherry just couldn't seem to get a handle on her life. As hard as she tried to make everyone around her happy, she herself was often miserable. I'm going to share part of her story, and maybe as I do, some of you can relate. Under the shower, Sherry's mind moved out of first gear. She began mentally ticking off the day's schedule. Todd, 9, and Amy, 6, would have been a handful even if she wasn't a working parent. Let's see, she thought, fix breakfast, pack 2 lunches, finish sewing Amy's costume for the school play. Now that's going to be a trick. Finish sewing the costume before the carpool picks her up at 7:45. And as she went over her day, her mind began to drift back to the night before. She thought regretfully about last night. She'd planned to work on Amy's costume that night, using her talents to make her a very special costume for her special little girl. But her mother had dropped over unexpectedly, and good manners dictated that she play hostess, and another evening was shot. The memories of her attempts to salvage the time weren't pretty. But trying to be diplomatic, Sherry artfully told her mother, "Mom, you can't imagine how much I enjoy your surprise visits, but I was wondering, would you mind if I worked on Amy's costume while we talk?" Sherry cringed inwardly, correctly anticipating her mother's response. "Sherry, you know I'd be the last to intrude on your time with family." Now, Sherry's mother, widowed for 12 years, had elevated her widowhood to the status of martyrdom. "I mean, since your father died, it's been such an empty time. I still miss our family. How could I deprive you of that for yourself?" "I'll bet I find out how," Sherry thought to herself. "That's why I can't understand why you don't bring Walt and the children to see me much anymore. I can understand why I might not be very entertaining. I'm just a lonely old lady who gave her entire life to her children. Who would want to spend time with me anyway?" "No, Mom, no. Sherry quickly joined the emotional minuet that she and her mom had been dancing for decades. "That's not what I meant at all. I mean, it's so special having you over. Goodness knows, with our schedule, we'd like to visit more, but we just haven't been able to do so. And that's why I'm glad you took the initiative. Lord, don't strike me dead for this little lie," she prayed silently. "In fact, I can do the costume at any old time," Sherry said. "And forgive me for that lie too. Now, why don't I make us some coffee?" Her mother sighed. "All right, if you insist, but I just hate to think that I was intruding." Well, the visit lasted well into the night. By the time her mother left, Sherry felt absolutely crazy, but she justified it to herself, saying to herself, "At least I've helped make her lonely day a little bit brighter." And then a pesky voice piped up, "If you helped so much, why was she still talking about her loneliness when she left?" Trying to ignore the thought, Sherry went to bed. Folks, boundaries are so important. And I think a lot of us have a hard time even understanding what they are, and many of us have never even heard of the concept of boundaries. Boundaries ask the question, what is mine to own? What is mine to own? Now, in the Garden of Eden, God taught Adam and Eve about ownership way back in the book of Genesis. He said, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over every living creature that moves on the ground. Made in the image of God, Adam and Eve were created to take responsibility for certain tasks. God set parameters for them. This is your job. And by implication, everything else is not. So part of taking responsibility or ownership is knowing what our job is and what our job is not. I don't know if you've ever had an employee or been an employee who didn't know what their job really was. They were confused about the parameters of their responsibilities, so either they weren't meeting them, and you were frustrated, and they were frustrated, and the relationship was strained, or perhaps they were going far beyond the responsibilities, and they were on the brink of collapse and burnout. Well, it's not a whole lot different in our other relationships. It's really important to know what our job is and what our job is not. A wife or a friend or a son or a father who doesn't know what their job is in that relationship will also be frustrated and angry and maybe even burn out. I think we really underestimate the role that healthy boundaries play in our lives, because our boundaries, they touch all of our interactions. Every single human connection we have is touched by our boundaries. Now, a lot of the time when it comes to boundaries, we aren't even aware that we have a problem at all. I want to read for you another story from the book. This one is about a 25-year-old man who came to see Henry Cloud with a common request. They wanted him to fix their son, Joshua. And when he asked what Joshua's problem was and why he wasn't there, they said, oh, well, he didn't want to come. Well, why? I asked. I'm going to switch to his voice now. Well, he doesn't think that he has a problem, they replied. Well, maybe he's right. Maybe he doesn't have a problem, I said. Tell me about it. Well, they recited a history of problems that had begun at a very, very young age. Joshua had never been quite up to snuff in their eyes. In recent years, he had exhibited problems with drugs and an inability to stay in school, find a career. Now, it was apparent that they loved their son very much, and they were heartbroken over the way he was living. They had tried everything they knew to get him to change and live a responsible life, but all of it had failed. He was still using drugs, avoiding responsibility, and keeping questionable company. They told me that they had always given him everything he needed. They supported him financially at school. They said because then he wouldn't have to work and he'd have plenty of time for study and a social life. When he flunked out of one school or he stopped going to classes, they were more than happy to do everything they could to get him into another school where it might be better for him. After they had talked for a while, I responded, I think your son is right. I don't think he has a problem. Well, you could have mistaken their expression for a snapshot. They stared at me for a full minute in disbelief. Finally, the father said, did I hear you right? You don't think he has a problem? Well, that's correct, I said. He doesn't have a problem. You do. He can pretty much do whatever he wants, no problem. You pay, you fret, you worry, you plan, you exert energy to keep him going. He doesn't have a problem because you have taken it from him. Those things should be his problem. But as it now stands, they're yours. Would you like for me to help you help him to have some problems? Well, they looked at me like I was crazy, but some lights were beginning to go on in their head. What do you mean, help him to have some problems? The father asked. Well, I explained, I think the solution to this problem would be to clarify some boundaries so that his actions cause him problems and not you. What do you mean by boundaries? The father asked. Well, look at it this way. It's as if he's your neighbor, and your neighbor never waters his lawn. But whenever you turn on your sprinkler system, your water falls on his lawn. Your grass is brown and it's dying, but Joshua looks down at his green grass and he thinks, my yard's doing pretty fine. That is how your son's life is. He doesn't study or plan or work, yet he has a nice place to live, plenty of money, and all the rights of a member of a family who is doing his part. If you would define property lines a little better, you would fix the sprinkler system so that the water would fall on your lawn, and if he didn't water his own lawn, he would have to live in dirt. And he might not like that after a while. I don't know if you can relate to these stories that I've shared, and I do encourage you to pick up the book if any of this sparks you at all. In the physical world, it's so easy to see where boundaries are most of the time because we're really good at putting up fences. I remember last spring I arrived at the trailer park and I looked at our new neighbors just off to the right, and beyond their trailer was the tallest fence I'd ever seen. I mean, it must have been 12 feet tall. There was no spacing between the boards. And I thought, he is definitely sending a message to his neighbor on the other side. I mean, he might as well have put a sign on it that said, keep out. We don't want to interact with you. I came to later find out that his kids and their kids did not get along very well. And he was a contractor with lots of wood at his disposal. And so he took an hour or two and he built this giant fence. He was in essence saying, this is my property, that's your property, stay on your side. The problem for us is that we don't have fences, emotionally speaking. We can't just erect a fence. We need to then put in place our own boundaries. And a lot of the time, we put our fence on our neighbor's side. And a lot of the time, we just don't erect a fence at all. Everybody has free access to our property. Now, some boundaries are harder to pinpoint than others. I want to give you 5 examples of some boundaries. This is what a boundary looks like. This is what a fence looks like. I feel shut out when you take over the conversation. That's a clear boundary. Let me into the conversation. Let me speak. I have a right as a human being. My reasons are personal, and I don't have to explain them to you. Some of you are cringing. Who would ever say that? But honestly, as a human being, this is a true statement. If you are an adult, you get to say this. I'm so grateful for your advice, but I'm going to try something else. I appreciate you sharing it with me, but I'm going to go in another direction. I understand the urgency, but this is not something I can take on right now. I bet a lot of us here need to learn this sentence, don't we? And then here's my favorite. No. If you could take anything away from this, hear me clearly. No is a complete sentence. And as an adult, you are allowed to use that complete sentence when it's appropriate. These are examples of boundaries. As Canadians, we're so polite, we're so nice. As Christians, we want to be even nicer, so it can be really hard sometimes to say these kinds of things. But boundaries are important because boundaries define what is me and what is not me. If you don't know what I'm talking about, hang on a little longer and hopefully it will become clear. You see, a boundary shows me where I end and where someone else begins. And what happens is when we understand where I end, we start to develop a sense of ownership, but ownership of my life and nobody else's. And so what happens is this frees me up to not have to own things that don't belong to me. And a lot of you are walking around carrying things that don't belong to you. They really don't. Now, one of the questions that I have myself, and I anticipate you saying, is, aren't Christians supposed to bear each other's burdens? I mean, so far it kind of sounds like I'm saying, I just need to worry about Alton and nobody else, right? Well, that's not what I'm saying. I want to say this. We are responsible to others, but for ourselves. You know what I mean? We're responsible to others, but for ourselves. Let me elaborate a little bit further. I want to take you into the book of Galatians where it says, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. What a great verse. What an inspirational verse to carry each other's burdens. I've kind of had this image of someone who's got a big boulder, a load they just can't carry, and they need you to hop in there and take the other side and help them carry this boulder to where it needs to go. And of course, I can't help but think about the Bible verses that talk about how Jesus bore our sins on the cross. Our sins, a load that we could not bear alone, he took them and he bore them for us. But then, okay, that's verse 2. Have you ever gone a little further and read verse 5? For each one should carry their own load. It's a bit confusing, right? Are we supposed to bear each other's burdens, or are we supposed to carry our own load? Which is it? Well, here's the thing. This word burden in the original language, in the Greek, it talks about an excess burden. The image behind this word is something that is just too big for you. It's something that arises where you just can't carry it alone. And so he's saying, when you see someone in distress and they're going through something that they simply can't carry, jump in and help them out. After all, that's what Christ did for all of us, for all of humanity. Now, this other word here, load in the Greek, okay, this is the word that has that connotation of kind of strapping on your backpack. It's your daily load. It's that stuff that you're responsible for. So it's not contradictory, it's just confusing because we don't speak the original Greek. And what it's saying is each of us is responsible to carry our own daily load, to understand what that is and to carry it and not burden others by it. So we're responsible for ourselves. But also when I see a brother or a sister or anyone really who's got a load that's too big to carry, in fact, that's half the reason I became a pastor in the first place, is to jump in there and help them with their burden, their excess burden. Does it start to make sense? I think it will if I ask this question. There's two problems that mainly arise out of this. The first is when excess burdens are confused with daily loads. So when a person walks around and they see their daily loads as a boulder that someone else needs to carry, what happens in this situation? What happens here? When you see your excess burdens confused with daily loads. Well, you might refuse help, right? You think your burden this excessive burden is just something that you need to carry on your own, right? It's not a daily load, but you think it is, so you don't reach out for help. A lot of guys have this problem. A lot of guys are walking around carrying boulders as if it's their backpack, and it's not. And the other one is confuse your daily load with an excess burden. And so you think that your burden is not what it is. Now, what happens if you confuse your daily load with an excess burden? Well, you're continually seeking help. You're making everything someone else's problem. So, the question is, how do I establish healthy boundaries? How do I do that? Well, this could be an 8-week series, and I'm going to take a minute and a half to sum it up for you. The first thing that you need to do is ask, what is mine to own? Go through your life, look at your relationships, and there's some relationships in your life where you just feel like, I think they might be using me. I don't think this is reciprocal. I think that when I listen to them talk, like that woman's mother, at the end of the day, she goes home and I feel worse and she feels no better. And that's not right. Or in that relationship with that 25-year-old son, he needs a few more problems in his life. Because his parents trying to give him everything, they're not doing him any favors. See, that's one of the problems about this, is if we don't have healthy boundaries, we think we're being nice, but we're actually doing harm to the other person. So we need to figure out what is mine to own. And that can take some introspection, maybe even an appointment with a therapist. Now, I'm going to give you 3 steps once you've figured that out. Number 1, be as clear and straightforward as possible. Don't raise your voice. You have to be clear about your boundaries. You can't hint at them. I read so many blogs and books, and this is the number 1 rule, because as nice Christian Canadians, we want to say, well, would you mind if? Well, I really think that. No, you need to be clear and straightforward. You don't need to be a jerk about it, but clear and straightforward. Number 2, state your need or request directly in terms of what you'd like rather than what you don't want or don't like. And this is just a simple rule for any communication. State your need, your request, in the positive, what you'd like to see. I'd like to see us have an equal relationship of communication, right? That sounds so much more better. Sorry, that's my New Brunswick heritage coming out. That sounds so much more better than saying, I don't like it when, right? They do. My family talks that way. They also use ain't a lot. Step 3, accept any discomfort that arises as a result, whether it's guilt, shame, or remorse. And this is a big step. You see, what's going to happen is once you start putting up fences or you start moving fences out a little bit, people are not going to appreciate it. Now, some might. The healthy people in your life will appreciate it. And if you're clear and you're respectful and you're kind in the way you approach it, then they'll say, you know what, that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's reconfigure our property lines here. But I want you to remember that the only people who get upset about you now having boundaries are the ones who were benefiting from you having none. When you start establishing boundaries, you're going to quickly discover those who are really benefiting from your lack thereof. And they're going to be angry. So you have to be willing to bear that burden for a time. But in the end, it's better for you, and it's better for them. It's better for everybody when we have healthy boundaries. Let us pray.